Hey everyone, this is a piece by Diethard Behrens. It's titled "A Communist Left Beyond Leninism." Um, this is an introduction to a book published in Germany titled "Marxist Anti-Leninism," uh, published with K. Verlag. Um, yeah, so here we go. With Eastern Europe's departure from the Soviet model, the overwhelming majority of those who in recent years believed that they had to identify with the Bolsheviks seem to have finally freed themselves from their youthful errors. The others, who even then criticized the equation of Soviet power and socialism, have now also shelved the option of a humane socialism with their revolutionary ambitions. Gorbachev's reforms initially sparked general euphoria in the West. While the press rejoiced in anticipation of the Soviet Union's return to the ranks of civilized capitalist nations, the remnants of the left pinned all kinds of hopes on Gorbachev for reform, including for the petrified conditions in the West. These expectations now seem to have been dashed. The left's helplessness and speechlessness in the face of the changes is not least due to the precarious relationship that bound the left to the history of the Soviet Union. Almost everyone had referred positively to the tradition of the October Revolution, even if this was usually accompanied by the dream of leading the quote, horse of history, which Mayakovsky says is limping, by the reins himself as a revolutionary. The widespread fixation on an image of the October Revolution as the historical power of the revolutionary masses and their avant garde, even if momentarily, went hand in hand with an attitude that sensed in every quote, attack on the Soviet Union, end quote, a quote, blow to the heart of the revolution, end quote, parenthesis, Weinert / Eisler, in parenthesis, and in every criticism of Leninism a swing to the bourgeois camp. To this day, the relationship with the Soviet Union represents a relationship trap for the left from which the left seems unable to escape. The dream of the realization of socialism, which is linked to the myth of the Soviet Union, seemed to allow only two positions: commitment to the revolution, and as a consequence, unconditional identification with the quote, fatherland of socialism, whose real politics corresponded little to the content associated with this term, or demarcation in the name of socialism, the anti-revolutionary attitude and affirmation of existing conditions that this implies, however, seem to be less the consequence than the requisite of the, quote, not like this, end quote. For the socialist parties corrupted in the First World War, the, quote, Bolshevik revolution was suitable as an identity-forming counterimage. A critique of Bolshevik politics in the spirit of a decidedly revolutionary socialism, as formulated by Rosa Luxemburg, also fell into the vortex of this relationship trap. Left-wing positions that felt repelled by the conformism of social democracy only found a place in the communist parties in the 1920s and 1930s, just as all those who wanted to escape the processes of Bolshevization and Stalinization of the communist parties had no choice but to form minority groups, such as August Thalheimer, Karl Korsch, Amadeo Bordiga, and others, or to join the side of the Free West, at the latest in exile, parentheses, such as Franz Birkenau, Arthur Koestler, and Menes Sperber. I don't know who Menes Sperber is. Menes Sperber lived from 1905 to 1984. Menes Sperber was an Austrian-French novelist, essayist, and psychologist. He also wrote under the pseudonyms Jan Heger and N.A. Menlos. Back to the text. When the student movement in the Federal Republic of Germany constituted itself as the New Left, It had an inkling that its political effectiveness depended on the extent to which it succeeded in escaping the relationship trap and putting the socialist revolution back on the agenda against those who had always postponed it and finally abandoned it altogether in order to build up industry and save the fatherland. It therefore had no choice but to repeatedly discuss the role of the Soviet Union, the revolution of 1917, and the role of Stalinism, above all in order to be able to critically confront the theory of totalitarianism, which is also virulent on the left. The difficulties with the Soviet Union crystallized around the precarious relationship between the myth of the October Revolution, which had not lost its fascination as an opportunity for identification for the majority of the New Left, and the obvious consequences of Stalinist and Soviet imperial policies. As a simple solution to the questions raised, the theory of betrayal of the ideals of the great socialist revolution was widespread, and in various versions that only differed in the change in the attributions of who actually embodied these ideals. The theory of social imperialism in the Soviet Union was also widespread, and its morally distinct status could hardly conceal the great disappointment with the development of the communist parties. Moreover, when comparing imperialisms, it lost the social criteria. Since 1967/68, the New Left has been criticizing the bureaucratization and objectification of social conditions in the Soviet Union, a criticism that seeks to focus on the state and industrial form of rule. A serious study of the historical analysis of Russian conditions has only recently begun. The post-war experience, which is important for the New Left, is characterized by the recognition of a National Socialist continuity beneath the big politics, by the continuity of anti-communist attitudes, the recognition of worldwide neocolonialism, by the experience of an incapable left in the face of the old Communist Party's fixation on the Soviet Union, and by the experience that the left itself was increasingly pushed out of the SPD and became socially marginalized, which can be seen in the history of the SDS. For the older Marxism, as well as for the SDS and the student movement, the revolution of 1917 remained the prime example of a socialist revolution. The decisive criticism came from the Frankfurt SDS circle around Hans-Jürgen Kroll. Kroll summarized the state of the discussion and the reception of Marx at the time when he states in his commentary on Czech reform communism that, quote, according to Marx and Engels, communism aims at the, quote, production of the form of exchange itself, end quote, in which the value substantial production relationship of abstract labor, which isolates the privately working producers from one another, is destroyed by means of socialization fought for by revolution, in order to open up the possibility of the, quote, associated mode of production, end quote. Paresh Chattopadhyay makes a big stink about the concept of the associated mode of production. Of the, quote, associated mode of production, end quote, of the direct producers, and finally of the unconstrained, quote, association of free people, end quote. Footnote. See Hans-Jürgen Kroll, Constitution and Class Struggle. One second. I don't see any really good descriptions for this book. Anyway. Where am I? Against this background, the identification of the Soviet Union's socialism was impossible. Those who saw themselves as spokesmen for an emancipation movement could only see a destructive formalism in the centralist organizational model. Those who, as students of Max Horkheimer and Theodore W. Adorno, had learned to link commodity production with alienation and industrial development with real subsumption under the capitalist system, had completely lost their impartiality toward the slogans of, quote, building socialism. Those who were even remotely aware of the problems of the connection between capitalism and the bourgeois nation-state saw themselves forced to hold on to the postulate of an international revolutionary movement. But these critical insights into Leninism played an increasingly smaller role in the debate with the Marxist-Leninist parties that were springing up everywhere. For the critics of the Leninist organizational model, spontaneity soon became a brand name. Parenthesis, Revolutionary Struggle, Proletarian Front, Bremen, Workers' Cause, Munich, end parenthesis. When the slogans, quote, 1 mark for all, end quote, and, quote, destroy what destroys you, end quote, were not successful quickly enough, they switched to, quote, politics in the first person, end quote. Internationalism remained an after-work activity precisely where the new composition of the international working class, parenthesis, Karl-Heinz Roth, and parenthesis, presented the, quote, factory workers with problems that were difficult to solve. The departure of the real existing working class led via the detour of, quote, non-work, end quote, to a subjectivism that soon became susceptible to certain variants of conservatism and nationalism. In this, they then met with those who had meanwhile gone through the communist parties. At that time, they had adopted from Leninism not only the organizational model and revolutionary discipline, but also the fixation on the state. Depending on how little they could recognize themselves in the Stalinist development of the USSR, the national carryout of the revolution that had been replaced as a point of identification, Albania and China instead of Russia. They invoked the dialectic of repression and revolution, expressed moral protest against the power state, and operated with an independent understanding of practice, which, as actionist, had long since lost its former ironic character as a form of demonstration and had congealed into a form whose function, just like the politics of the Communist Party in the 1920s, was no longer considered. The general characteristics of these groups could then be the identity of morality in politics or a moralizing politicism, and this often despite an economistic reception of Marx. Following the victory of Vietnam and the Pol Pot regime, a large part of the supporters of these groups were overwhelmed by events and caught up in disillusionment, just like the devout communists after 1930 and 1945. The reception of traditional communism was often linked to the problem of the reaction to fascism through a specific perspective. At least in part, the legitimation of Georg Lukács was accepted that a predicament existed at that time in that, in view of the looming fascism, one could only decide in favor of communism, despite all detailed criticism. The political and historical determinism underlying this polar construction played a major role for the Marxist-Leninists in general and also for the Mao-Stalinist variants. Historical situations were reduced to simple decision-making situations. This mechanism of forced partisanship, however, only concealed the problem, which is how to understand the, quote, revolutionary aspect of the October Revolution and how to judge this form of industrial society that differed from Western capitalism as a step back or step forwards on the way to socialism, as state capitalism, parenthesis, whatever that means, and parenthesis, as an independent variant of capitalist development, or merely as a totalitarian state. In the following, The current state of debates about the Soviet Union and socialism will be briefly outlined, as it defined the horizon of left-wing criticism in the 1970s. The thesis will be put forward here that it is essential to return to this state of affairs in order to understand current events in the Soviet Union, especially where it has begun to emerge from the relationship trap described above. A debate about planned and market economies. A debate about planned and market economies had already developed in the 20s. Friedrich Pollock, who's just a side note, I have Pollock, a biography of Pollock and Pollock's State Capitalism. It's possibilities and limitations on this channel. But Friedrich Pollock, for example, was clearly enthusiastic about the planned economy experience in the Soviet Union. See Friedrich Pollock, Die plantwirtschaftlichen Versuchs in der Russland. Not seeing any good descriptions of this book. Back to the text. Plan and market were then clearly separated and assigned to socialism and capitalism. In the Soviet debate, similar ideas can be found in Preobrazhensky and later in the Trotskyists. Others, such as Bukharin, were more cautious. The schematic juxtaposition of plan and market obstructs realistic access to socioeconomic problems. However, the idea of plan and market as mutually exclusive is nonsense, insofar as there have always been and are various types of markets in the, quote, socialist planned state, end quote, and its planifications have shaped the history of capitalist, quote, market economies from the very beginning, and indeed market and plan form a specific necessary unit of capitalist economy. Theories of transitional society, the theories of the transitional society, Bukharin et al., played a crucial role, particularly within the Soviet economic debate. Their assumption that the Soviet Union was a society in transition to socialism remained unquestioned. Transitional societies were supposed to relate to the transformation of capitalist into socialist societies. In reality, the countries mentioned were underdeveloped countries of the first and third world, which can at best be described as emerging countries, and the transformation was merely a means of building up specific national capital, which helped temporarily to increase opportunities on the world market. Footnote. See Andre Gunder Frank, The Current Crisis and the Perspectives of the World System, in Johann Blaschke's Perspectives of the World System, Materials and Emanuel Wallerstein, quote, The Modern World System, published in 1983. I don't see any descriptions for this book. Back to the text. Shaul Bet-Lim's analysis of socialist commodity production was influential for the development of theory in the New Left. In Bet-Lim's discussion of his transitional societies, Bet-Lim refers to a fundamental contradiction, the paradox of socialist commodity production. From a socialist perspective, this is about the abolition of commodity production as an expression of capitalist conditions. This utopia imagined that decisions about the forms and content of production, about the distribution of work and products, would be made in a grassroots democratic process namely by the, quote, associated producers, end quote, without mediation by money and markets. However, it was no coincidence that the Soviet planned economy held on to money, prices, and units of account, according to Bettelheim. This is because it was generally forced by the structure of production processes as they are currently available to us. As a result of the contradiction between the, quote, socialist planning moment and, quote, commodity production, all possible forms of markets and capital formation can be found in the Soviet Union, which can hardly be understood and influenced. The contradiction inherent in the concept of socialist commodity production was also taken up in Frankfurt discussions by Hans-Jürgen Kroll, Alfred Schmidt, Helmut Reichel, and Hans-Georg Backhaus, in their focus on the money problem as the key to understanding Marx's theory of capital. The question of what a socialist revolution in forms of exchange could actually mean was radicalized. For Kroll, for example, turns against Otto Sick's attempt to, quote, discredit the genuinely Marxist doctrine of the demise of goods and money in the period of economic transformation as a non-binding ideal abstraction tainted with the odium of Stalinism. For Marx, on the other hand, the issue of alienation and reification is analytically inseparable from the socially generalized commodity production through the exchange of capital and wage labor. The fact that industrial production, which is in principle historicized, eludes the conscious control of the producers with the apparent force of nature. In the concept and existence of the money form of the commodity, the natural contingency of a historical process that is in principle consciously possible for human beings is crystallized, end quote. Hans-Jürgen Kroll. Wikipedia says Otto Sick lived from 1919 to 2004 and was a Czech economist and politician. Otto Sick was the man behind the new economic model, economic liberalization plan, and Otto Sick was also one of the key figures in the Prague Spring. And back to the text. This does not mean that the capital relationship has already been understood by understanding the money form, and it also does not mean that the real socialist economies are to be simply identified with the Western capitalist economies because the real socialist economies operate commodity production in a monetary economy. It is precisely because the tradition of the New Left, in the New Left's debate with Marx, either dragged along the diffuse use of the commodity category in critical theory, or where it attempted to be precise, lost itself in problems of monetary theory, that it failed to develop a concept of the capitalist socialization context. Not least for this reason, when attempting to analyze the economic realities of Soviet development, as with any other subject, even critical leftists resort to a hodgepodge of neo-Ricardian and other economic approaches, if not completely neglect the economic dimension of social conditions in favor of a politicistic approach. The precarious relationship between a political approach to economic problems is also evident in the proponents of the bureaucracy and objectification thesis. Who on the one hand see the Soviet bureaucracy as an essential element of forced industrialization, while on the other hand highlighting the objectification as a form of bureaucratic functioning in industry. See Walter Suess and Winfried Thaw. 1 second, I'm going to look these people up. It looks like Walter Suess is a historian and political scientist. His work focuses on the history of the GDR and the Ministry for State Security. And Winfried Thaw. Come on. German Wikipedia says, Winfried Thaw, born 1952, is a German political scientist and university lecturer. He is professor of political theory and history of ideas at the University of Trier. Thaw studied political science, philosophy, and German at the University of Tübingen and the Bologna Center of Johns Hopkins University. Winfried Thaw received his doctorate from the University of Tübingen in 1982 with a thesis on the subject of domination as objectification. Winfried Thaw received his habilitation from the University of Tübingen in 1995 with the habilitation thesis, The Rebirth of Politics, Civil Society, and Legitimacy Conflict in the Revolutions of 1989. He then taught at the universities in Tübingen, Denver, Colorado, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Bologna. Thaw's research focuses on democratic theory, political representation, cultural criticism, and political thought in the 20th century, especially in the thinking of Hannah Arendt, as well as the context of globalization, civil society, and democracy. Winfried Thaw led the subproject C7 Forms and Functions of Political Representation of Foreigners and the Poor in the Federal Republic of Germany in the Collaborative Research Center 600, quote, Foreignness and Poverty, unquote, at the University of Trier. Back to the text. Bureaucracy understood in this way applies indiscriminately to capitalist and, quote, socialist conditions. It is not sufficiently considered that Weber conceives the bureaucratization process as the completion of the capitalist structural type, but this does not adequately clarify the social function of bureaucracy as an expression of always assumed rationalization processes. In his attempt to turn Lenin on his head, Rudi Dutschke gave an explanation of the Russian special path, which followed Marx's thesis of the Asian mode of production and the research of Karl August Wittfogel. I have an introduction to Wittfogel's thought on this channel, characterizes it as a, quote, semi-Asian mode of production, end quote. However, this approach would have to clarify why, despite the influence of European absolutism and the capitalization of Russia under the late Tsars, the tradition of, quote, semi-Asian state formation should have prevailed as the decisive trend in the development of the Soviet state. In the tradition of Rosa Luxemburg, the Jacobinism thesis was formulated, which is based on a structural comparison of the Russian and French revolutions, parenthesis, such historical comparisons are common in the 1920s, end parenthesis. It refers to similar socioeconomic problems and shows that the political models were analogous, i.e. radically bourgeois in a way. The thesis is based on analogies between elements from the Jacobin phase of the French Revolution and war communism, and links state requisition policy, agricultural supplies and army equipment, as well as the associated production, with a political model of central economic perspective on the one hand and an atomized base on the other. If one reduces the Jacobin phase of the USSR to this political model, or from an economic perspective to war communism, then no further problems arise. But if one tries to understand it as a specific social formation, and this is precisely what the comparison contained in the term Jacobinism assumes, then one would have to show what form bourgeois politics and economics coagulate into, and what characterizes their function in certain historical constellations. If in the student movement and afterwards the practical relevance appeared to be urgent, due to the relative isolation of the movement, which forced, among other things, a recourse to positive revolutionary models, and this false practical relevance also led to an alliance with the historically successful, then this not only represented a momentous functionalist orientation, but also a confusion of empirical factuality with historical practice. Do these orientations not execute what is connected with the problem of Jacobinism? The polar construction of people and leadership unit. Do these orientations not execute what is connected with the problem of Jacobinism? The polar construction of people and leadership unit. The necessity of planning and distribution. Are social production relations actually understood when they are only discussed as distribution relations of work, means of production, and means of consumption? From the perspective of the organization of this distribution, the people and the state elite inevitably fall apart. In the history of the left, the model of Jacobinism has either been affirmed or demonized. What has not been discussed is which societies such a form of state and economy is attractive to, and under what conditions. Socialism has always meant overcoming the bourgeois social forms established in the French Revolution. It was known from the beginning that the Soviet Union could not live up to this claim. Today, doubts are being cast everywhere as to whether socialist production relations can still be a political option. To say yes to this is to cling to a utopia of social conditions in which individual morality as a sacrifice is superfluous. Only if we can get away from identifying the Soviet Union and the Socialist Revolution, whether positively or negatively, and are able to assign the October Revolution its historical place in the context of development processes that are definitely influenced by capitalism, do we have a chance of re-examining changes in social conditions in the direction of what was once meant by socialism? Otherwise, there's only the third way between a variant of the same society, sometimes characterized by more market, sometimes by more state, and sometimes by more, sometimes less co-determination, but always by economic constraints, bourgeois forms of communication, and national imperial power structures. The Soviet model was criticized early on. Apart from the well-known criticism of Rosa Luxemburg, it was primarily the Dutch-German left that raised it. When the radical wing of Dutch social democracy split off in 1907, the principle of radical enlightenment instead of mass organization was proclaimed as an important strategic element of Marxism. Anton Pannekoek, Hermann Gorter, and Henrietta Rolandholst very quickly pushed for a confrontation with Kautsky and later with Lenin. Already united with the Bremen left and the Lichtstrahlen group in 1915, the Dutch-German group then traded as the, quote, International Socialist of Germany, end quote, ISD, and from 1918 as the, quote, International Communists of Germany, IKD. Involved in the debates about the founding of the KPD, it left the party with the left wing and founded the, quote, Communist Workers' Party of Germany. After their split, it retained a small independent group during the Weimar Republic. In Holland, during the German occupation, it united with the Trotskyists, from whom it separated again after the war. It was not so much their organizational activity that gave them importance, but rather a partly propagandistic, partly theoretical effect, which is mainly due to Gorter and Pannekoek. Two theses were decisive for their work. Firstly, they believed, in a subjectivist way, that the avant-garde positions were the only thing that mattered in initiating spontaneous mass action. Secondly, they propagated strict council communism and demanded that the factory organizations have power over production. The first thesis argues from a high regard for subjectivity, for proletarian self-confidence, as Pannekoek and Gorter put it. It only becomes understandable against the background of a philosophical Kantian Marxism, which includes this self-confidence as an ethical postulate. The second thesis is still certainly relevant, even if it is certainly no longer conceivable in the simple form received from the Council Communists, because the experience with the producer-democratic approaches to solving problems affecting society as a whole has made the problem of the political and social framework more apparent. The central point of contention among the Council Communist theorists was the criticism of the politics of the Communist parties, not only in their Stalinist form, but also of their theoretical foundations, Lenin's theory. Pannekoek's work, Lenin as a Philosopher, published in 1938, referred to bourgeois materialism as the fundamental element and basis of Lenin's philosophical views. It was evident to Pannekoek that this conception of a materialistic worldview also had consequences for Lenin's understanding of politics. Bourgeois materialism implied a naturalistic understanding of natural laws, and thus suggested a corresponding understanding of absolutely necessary social laws. Pannekoek criticized this because it meant that the awareness of understanding natural laws as rules for understanding certain natural phenomenon was lost. The same applied to social processes. Pannekoek's criticism of Lenin was not one of the first, but certainly one of the most important documents of such criticism. Paul Mattick, who was influenced by the Council Communists and was the most important organizer of Council Communist workers' groups in the USA, followed Henrik Grossman in economic theory. Mattick tried to reconcile the latter's rationalist reception of Marx with the Council Communist ideal. The post-war development in the USA, supported by an apparently unbroken prosperity, which thus made a change in worker strategies necessary, prompted Mattick to develop the idea of a mixed economy as a possible transformation model on the one hand, but on the other hand to rely on a Marxism as mine hunting, which in micrological work seeks to identify the tiny fractures in society as starting points for an emancipatory policy. Even if the broad impact was lacking, and the political approach is often presented in a subjectivist manner, the policy of the Council Communists was aimed at a non-Leninist communist practice. In the approach that went beyond Bolshevism, see the Theses on Bolshevism of 1934, which are on this channel. Even if the description of Russia's historical situation was stuck in the cliché of the, Westerners, the possibility of a different development of history than the one that occurred shimmers through. That's the end of the piece. There's a footnote here for an edited work by Gottfried Mergner, Group of International Communists in Holland. Motherfucker. Yeah, I can't find anything for this. Anyway, thanks for listening.